after the modern period, philosophers shift the focus from metaphysics, which the ancient and medieval world kind of thought was the first and preeminent of all sciences. They kind of start with metaphysics. And then we get with the Enlightenment philosophers saying, well, wait a minute. To be able to make these claims about metaphysics, what's out there, what exists, what's real, kind of assumes that you have some basis for the knowledge claims, first of all. So we're looking for the question of epistemic criteria. What is our criteria of knowledge? What is our notion of justification? How do we justify our claims? And it's certainly true that Plato and early philosophers did talk about justified true belief, and that does continue into the modern period for the notion of giving good reasons for why we believe what we believe, to ground our beliefs. But you'll notice that with, for example, David Hume, the question, well, actually with Descartes, right, the question shifts to the notion of certitude, indubitable certitude with the cogito and whatnot. And with David Hume, we get a more precise, specific fleshing out of what this problem actually is. And it's a problem of logical entailment and the fact that we can't be circular if we're going to be empiricists or foundationalists, etc. And so we're going to have to be able to deal with this problem of knowledge and having a criteria of knowledge somehow, unfortunately, being in a box. Because how are we going to know our criteria of knowledge without having a prior delineation or knowledge criteria for our knowledge criteria? And this is what we want to see Mannion point out with really good, clear lucidity. So he had been talking about why falsification theory wasn't really a good approach to verifying our beliefs in terms of evidentialism and evidential claims, sufficiency and proof. The notion of what it is to have sufficient proof is ambiguous. And this is what happens in epistemology. The problem of falsification is in the same problem as the rest of the answers. And so let's start with this question of the uniformity of nature. Now, universal propositions also make claims about nature, and I can barely read this. Future, I can't read that word. Future, we'll say instantiations of the subject. I can barely read it. But this is only so if nature is uniform. So this is Hume's question, right? He raises the question of induction or the uniformity of nature. How do we know that the future will be like the past? Since that's a principle that underlies the possibility of any science, right? So we're asking a pre-scientific question, a pre-epistemic question, a question that's prior to the doing of science, right? Which is the question of uniformity of nature and induction, that the future will be like the past, regularity of nature. But this only works if nature is uniform. Autonomous man cannot demonstrate the uniformity of nature. And by autonomous man here, this is in the context of empiricism. If you're an empiricist, atheist, finite human being that begins his reasoning process from the human mind, then we're in this problem of not being able to get to universal states of affairs and universal claims. Bertrand Russell explains this problem very well. It has been argued that we have reason to know that the future will resemble the past because what was the future has constantly become the past and always has been found to resemble the past, so that we really have the experience of the future, namely of times which were formerly future, which we call past futures. But such an argument begs the very question at issue. We have experience of past futures, but not future futures. And the question is, what future futures resemble past futures? This question is to be answered by an argument which starts with past futures alone. We therefore still seek for some principle which will enable us to know that the future will follow the same lines as the past. So you'll notice from the time of David Hume all the way up to Bertrand Russell, the exact same problem has been asked and restated. And it's a problem that plagues secular atheistic epistemology and philosophy because it doesn't have a way on the basis of empirical sense data to justify the belief that the future will be like the past. And the belief that the future will be like the past, again, underlies the possibility of any scientific endeavor. So what we're cutting to the chase here over is that science apparently is going to be, scientism is unable to justify its first principles and its starting point. Next, he mentions the deductive problem. Without justification for induction, which is what we were talking about above, right? The uniformity of nature. There is no universal proposition. I can barely read. I have a printout is what I'm trying to read. So let me see. Maybe I can read the copy, the e-copy better. Let's see. Without justification for induction, let me read the e-copy. And for uniformity of nature, no universal propositions can be justified. So notice we're in the domain of, again, epistemic justification. These are well-known questions in epistemology. So the people that are getting mad that I've been asking these questions the last few days really are just unfamiliar with epistemology. These aren't foreign questions. They're not questions I'm word salad making up. They're fundamental questions in any epistemic textbook, any epistemology, Bonjour, the W.J. Wood book that we've talked about. Any text on epistemology will cover these topics. In fact, Mannion in the paper will cite many more epistemology texts, which also cover these issues. So without justification for induction, again, and the uniformity of nature, there are no universal propositions that can be justified. So we're not saying that you can't believe these things or that you don't say these things. We're asking for an account of these things on your own grounds. That's what we're asking for. And again, why am I talking about this? This is a recurring problem in every debate that we have, whether it's Matt Dillahunty, Trent Horn, T-Dump, the Muslims, Stefan Molyneux. It is always a question of foundationalism, evidentialism, empiricism, and the presuppositions involved in that approach to epistemology. So you guys will recall, every time I have this debate, I just simply boil people back down to this point and ask the same questions. So you'll notice in the Mannion paper, he goes on to say, in terms of logic, autonomous man could then make no direct case for the validity of logic. Well, first of all, he can't because of there being no grounding for induction or deduction. He cannot even say what logic is. Is logic a substance? Is it a property? Is it a concrete and a particular? Is it abstract and universal? What is it and where is it? This problem is particularly difficult for materialists. And as you guys know, you've heard me make this point many, many times in the last 5 years, the debates with the atheistic materialists. Not having a category for non-material universal entities, atheistic materialists often suggest that logic is merely some convention, aka a social construct. And then they become postmodernists. They become ridiculous, right? Self-refuting. This, of course, makes logic arbitrary and destroys its universality. That is a devastating critique and problem in those systems. Metaphysics and logic are closely related. Exactly. A point that you've heard me make endlessly. Remember the debate with Vegan Gains and Ask Yourself? The whole debate was, you may not ask me any meta-ethical or metaphysical questions. Okay, but that's assuming that these domains don't overlap and that they don't assume one another. Do we know that, for example, a priori Eastern monism is false? Well, if not, then possibly all A are also not non-A, right? And there is no non-A. But if there is no non-A, then the laws of the excluded middle and the non-contradiction principle, are they even meaningful? How do we know a priori that monists, for example, are wrong? Now, he's not arguing that that's true. Okay, so I know we had some people who didn't understand what a reductio argument is, or making a reductio. They thought that means that you affirm the absurd position. No, this is part of logic and argumentation and epistemology, is to raise questions that are defeaters. It does not mean that you affirm that position. How exactly do we know that all reality must conform? This is the key question that's going to be a problem for, and I want to raise this issue because it keeps coming up, especially with people who are a little more philosophically astute, especially people that focus on ancient and medieval metaphysics, aka Thomists, etc. They will raise this question of retorsion, and they will think that qualifies for justification. But as we can see in a moment, I want to show you guys why simply arguing that I don't see how it could be otherwise actually won't function to achieve epistemic justification. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't bring this up. It is important to point out, right, reductios. But reductio arguments aren't strong enough or good enough actually to get us to epistemic justification, and we'll see why. We'll give the defeater for why that is in just a second. And Mannion will make this point in a very lucid way here at the beginning, so there won't be much more reading. So he says, how exactly do we know that reality that's out there, all reality, conforms to these principles that we, individual humans, are calling logic? How do we know that there exists a world, in the world, a universal principle that says, if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, that he must be mortal? Now, I know a lot of people are going to hear this and say, well, it's true. Clearly, it's obviously self-evidently true. But Mannion is raising a different question here, right? He doesn't believe that it's not true. He's asking a Humean, or actually a Kantian kind of question. So let me bring up the next screenshot here of the next point, which is he's basically just restating a Kantian type of view. And he's not saying Kant's correct. I don't believe Kant's correct. This is an argument that's a defeater for that argument. Okay, so let's everybody get that clear. I'm not affirming Kant. It's just using this argument in the same way that we used Hume's argument above about induction and the regularity of nature, right? So what does this argument say? Can inductive or deductive inferences be marshaled on behalf of logic? We have already seen that the case for these principles themselves cannot be made. And he argued that earlier in the paper, right, when he was critiquing foundationalism. So don't accuse me of lying or not. It's just earlier in the paper. I started towards the end of the paper because this is where he's going to make the important point that I want to focus on today. Can inductive or deductive inferences be marshaled on behalf of logic? Well, so what we're going to do is we're going to raise Kant's question that how do we know that our conceptual scheme, right, the conceptual categories that we have for logic and universals and math and all these things in our head, that they actually match up to things that are out there in the world? Now, I think that we do have those things. But what we're investigating here is this is a problem for an empiricist type of position, especially for an evidentialist, for this kind of a position, for a peripatetic axiom type of position. Because although we may believe that that's the case, we want to know what is the argument for that being the case, you see, without relying on the principle of induction, deduction, or the assumption that the external world matches up to my conceptual schema from the outset, right? So you can't just appeal to things in the external world or to your metaphysical principles, because what we're asking is a question prior to those principles, right? And he says, more to the point, induction and deduction are methods that presuppose logic, okay? But this is a meta-logical question that we're asking about logic itself. So therefore, any direct case for logic will necessarily be involved in circular reasoning. So the point of this whole exercise is not to say that we don't have empirical sense data or knowledge, right? The point is not to say I'm a Humean. The point is to say that on the grounds of empiricism, evidentialism, natural philosophy, natural theology, et cetera, and its epistemology, we don't have a justification for its starting points and for its first principles and for its assumptions. And their only response is going to be either a circular argument, which will be a defeater for their foundationalist position, or it will be to be arbitrary. Well, it just is that way. And I don't see how it could be any other way. All right, that's what I meant by retorsion, right? Where we say, well, you could deny first principles. You could deny the reliability of sense perception. You could deny the existence of logic. But to do so would lead to reality being absurd. And I just simply don't see how it could be that way, right? We've heard this reply from many Thomists, from many Aristotelians, many philosophers who are a little more astute. Why does that not count for justification? This is the key point here. And all I need is one or two defeaters that are great examples to show that it doesn't achieve justification. It doesn't achieve justificatory status based on a couple defeaters. Now, this doesn't even mean that the defeaters are the case. All we have to do is say, on your own grounds, I could propose this defeater to demonstrate that you still can't or are not justified in the assumption. So the assumption here, right, that we're dealing with now, keep this in mind, is that reality out there in the external world corresponds to our conceptual categories or schemes and the logic in our head, right? How do we know that it does?